church history has it that they tie a rope to his ankle in case he passed out. Because if he passed out in there from maybe having a vision or something, nobody can go in and get him. Or they will fry up, you know? So apparently they would drag him out. I wonder if that ever happened. Pull it out, you know? So when you know, they go to pull the rope, and there's just like a little burning phrase. Okay, so I read this quote 2 days ago. Yeah, no, yesterday I guess it was. Feels like 2 days ago. By this guy. It was in my commentary, and I was reading it, and you know, I was kind of skimming. I was kind of looking for something. I read this quote, and I'm like, wait, what? I don't know if I agree with this guy. And then I come to find out that the guy whose commentary it was put it in as an example of what he didn't agree with. And I'm like, oh, okay, all right, okay. But I just want to read it to you because here's he was talking about the entrance of the high priest. One day a year, Day of Atonement, going into the Holy of Holies as, are you ready for this? A potentially dangerous infection coming right into the presence of God and rendering God liable to attack by demons. Sin as a demonic contagion which could be introduced into the sanctuary by human agents. And I was like, what? What's wrong with that mindset, right? Well, what I liked, and I forgot to write what the guy's response to it was, but his response to it was, actually, no, it shouldn't be God that's worried about an entrance into the holy things. It should be anything outside of God that should be worried about being affected. And I love that. What I love about that is I trust from your all response you got it. God's holiness is not threatened by any human or any sin or any demonic agent or anything that is one iota less than holiness. It's fried up. Just like you turn on a light switch. What happens in the dark? Gone, right? Church history has it that they tie a rope to his ankle in case he passed out. Because if he passed out in there from maybe having a vision or something, nobody can go in and get him. Or they will fry up, you know? So apparently they would drag him out. I wonder if that ever happened. Pull it out, you know? So whenever you know, they go to pull the rope, and there's just like a little burning phrase. Okay, tonight's review, I shortened it by a whole bunch because last week's review was actually sort of a continuation from the teaching before, and I apologize for that because I sort of felt like you really have to get this. I almost retaught the whole lesson again in last week's review, just because I wanted to make sure you all got the context, the nature of sacrifice, and the place of Leviticus in God's narrative redemption story. However, tonight, I'm assuming you know all this except one critical thing that I told that story about, which I guess I already told it. Understanding God's holiness is like a bright light, and anything less is darkness. And there's the quote that I was looking for from Wyndham. It is not God who is endangered by the pollution of sin, but man, right? Yeah, sin is death to us. It is not death to God. In fact, God is death to sinful man, okay? Okay, so then that's it for the long review. Then last week, we just basically covered 3 types of sacrifices. The burnt offering was the most common sacrifice. It is the principal atoning sacrifice in ancient Israel. The worshiper lays hands, he confesses, there's a transfer of guilt and sin. All of the animal is cremated. It is usually followed by a grain offering, which is more of sort of a tribute, a response of gratitude, expressing the intent that I will be obedient. Only a handful of grain would be burnt, and the rest would be given to priests. By the way, hi Linda, I know you're watching. Because some of you, Linda as well, expressed, wow, they didn't know that. So I thought I maybe ought to repeat this, that out of the 12 tribes of Israel, according to God's law, the Levites, who were the tribe of priests, would not be given any land. When they go in to conquer the promised land, they will divide it up into 11 parcels, and then the Levites will be spread out over all the land, but they will own no land of their own. What that means is they can't raise sheep or grain or wine or really olives or anything. And so part of the rules of the sacrifice in the temple is that they could keep a portion of the food, which, by the way, leads us to everybody's favorite offering in the Old Testament, the peace and fellowship offering. I call it everybody's favorite. I'm assuming it was their favorite because it was kind of like God's barbecue, right? Really, because they only burned up the fat, the liver, and the kidneys, and all the rest of the meat got given out. So the priests got some, and the people got some. And by the way, well, let me get this. It was for different reasons. Peace and fellowship could be confession or free will, or if you fulfilled a vow. But it was really part of a family feast, yeah? And so all of it would get eaten. I had one more part about that, but I think it comes up later in the study, so we'll save it because we're going to revisit all those offerings at the end of the study tonight. So before we continue, I want to express again that it is surprising to me because, you never really learn a subject as well as you do as when you attempt to teach it, especially to a group of people who are likely to ask difficult questions. And you're trying to get ahead of everybody and answer all the questions. So you're looking into all the minutiae. And I got to tell you, I am sort of struck and surprised at how muddled some of the Levitical rules are. In other words, the differences between a guilt offering, a sin offering, a purification, reparation offering, and when exactly did you do one type of offering, and when did you not, and what, it's not really as clear as maybe a good control freak would wish it were, yeah? And what some commentators have speculated that I appreciate is they speculate that a lot of it that was going on was sort of been common knowledge already, so they didn't have to put it in, but there's clearly some sort of gaps. So as I wrote, commentators speculate that there was a lot of assumed knowledge at the time that isn't available to us because they haven't been doing these sacrifices in 2,000 years, right? Ever since the time of Christ, which, by the way, is a very fascinating point that I'm going to skip right now because I want to get to it. Okay, so right now we ended up in chapter 3. We're going to kick off with two different types of purification offerings. So we've had the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace or fellowship offering, and now we're going to be talking about purification offerings. Okay, the early chapters were mostly about the animal, but now we're going to get more into the difference between an inadvertent sin, a sin of omission, and a deliberate sin. Scholars that I've been reading have sort of twisted themselves into pretzels trying to figure out the differences between all these sacrifices when all of them seem to involve things like confession and atonement, because we keep talking about the burnt offering. Well, that was about confession and atonement. Well, actually, so is the sin offering. Yeah, there's a few that involve confession and atonement. And so trying to figure out, well, what's the difference between them? Let me give you one example. The purification offering seems to be more about the purification of the place of worship so that God may be present among his people. In the purification offerings that we're going to look into tonight, there's a much wider variety of animals. There's bulls and goats. And by the way, the goats can be both male and female, like the burnt offering had to be male only. There's lambs, there's doves, there's pigeons. The really poor could bring an ephah of flour. It was considered less important than the burnt offerings. It was given less often, and it could be for a variety of reasons, which we will cover later on in the book. But I'll give you one example just to throw one out. If you'd given birth, well, then you had to go to a purification ceremony, which is really interesting if you think about it, because giving birth itself is not considered a sin. It is just something that's considered to make you unclean, sort of like, sorry ladies, but like leprosy would be another example of that. Some people want to get into the what was the problem with God and why did he hate women thing, but I don't think it's worth considering. This is just what was going on at the time. I'm just using that as an example about a purification rite. And also, by the way, when we read later on in tonight, because I know it gets confusing, I got confused by it, but when we read things like, and then the blood was splashed on the altar, that is not talking about the ark inside the Holy of Holies. You have the altar of incense, and you also have the altar of the burnt offerings, right? But again, the author of Leviticus doesn't seem like compelled to explain to us exactly which altar he's talking about, but I want to make it clear he is not talking about the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies, because we're saving that, or God's saving that, for chapter 16, okay? Just keep that in mind. Okay, so read with me. Go in chapter 4, and we're going to read a few scattering of verses. Read 1 to 3. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he must bring to the Lord a young bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. Now skip to verse 13. If the whole Israelite community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though the community is unaware of the matter, they are guilty. Now go to verse 22. When a leader sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the commands of the Lord the God, he is guilty. And now go to verse 27. If a member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, he is guilty. Okay, you with me? We've kind of covered the whole gamut of available people in the camp there pretty much. But all of those are all talking about unintentional sins. Notice, by the way, how the priest goes first, because with the priest, it's an idea that, hey, if the priest sins, it can affect the whole nation. Why? Because the priest serves in the temple. If the priest is unclean and he's got an issue, then we have a problem with the whole temple. And if the whole temple is unavailable, then nobody can go get sacrifices done, right? By the way, this is a really interesting concept. It's an idea of one man's sin affecting everybody. Unintentional sin. I wouldn't have to ask Alan how to pronounce it. I looked it up. The word for unintentional, I looked it up, Alan. It's actually pronounced like this. I thought it was classic. Shagaga. Shagaga literally means to wander, to go astray, or to make a mistake. It's kind of a wandering sin, sort of a almost, you don't want to quite say accidental, but yeah, almost like a mistake. The clearest definition I can give you is to compare it to the opposite of a shagaga sin, which would be, and I forgot to look up the Hebrew word for this, but is to read to you a different kind of sin from Numbers. So from Numbers chapter 15, verse 30 and 31. But anyone who sins defiantly, there's the word, yeah, defiantly, whether native born or foreigner, blasphemes the Lord and must be cut off from the people of Israel. Because they have despised the Lord's word and broken his commands, they must surely be cut off. Their guilt remains on them. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have an avenue of forgiveness, right? But clearly, God makes a big distinction between making a mistake, regretting that mistake, and then just flat out going, you can do this with your rules, God. I'll do what I want to do. The clearest definition I can give you, like in today's law, would be the difference between manslaughter and murder one, right? Premeditated murder usually gets you the death penalty in a lot of states, right? Lying in wait. Like, it's one thing to sort of, have a few cocktails, wipe out in a car and you kill somebody or whatever. It's quite another thing to be waiting in somebody's closet with a shotgun to take them out, right? Even our modern day legal systems recognizes a difference. One thing to keep in mind, though, however, there's degrees within these sins of omission. There's degrees about what you sacrifice that seem to be based on your status. And a lot of it comes down to the expense of the animal. So I don't know exactly, but apparently the priest has to bring a bull. But other people can bring a female, so maybe a female sheep was worth less or more, I don't know. And then if you were really poor, you brought a pigeon or, a handful of grain, right? And so the Word of God seems to make allowances for your status within this specific sin of unintentional sin. Whereas the burnt offering, you could not just bring any kind animal. Does that make sense? Yeah? So it seems to allow a lot for that. Otherwise, I don't know about a lot of the specifics. Yeah. No, I want to keep moving. I want to move, sorry. Sins of omission. Chapter 5, read verse 1 to 4. You know, I think the Catholics have sins of omission, right? I don't even need to explain it as much as that's basically, well, let's just read it, and it makes sense. Chapter 5. If a person sins because he does not speak up when he hears a public charge to testify regarding something he has seen and learned about, he will be held responsible. Or if a person touches anything ceremonially unclean, whether the carcasses of unclean wild animals or of unclean livestock or of unclean creatures that move along the ground, even though he is, and I underline this, unaware of it, he has become unclean and is guilty. Or if he touches human uncleanness, anything that would make him unclean, even though he is unaware of it, when he learns of it, I underline that in my Bible, he will be guilty. Or if a person thoughtlessly takes an oath to do anything, whether good or evil, in any manner one might carelessly swear about, and even though he is unaware of it, in any case, when he learns of it, he will be guilty. Now, all four of these, even though it seems like it was all specifically the first one, are all considered sins of omission. Why are they considered sins of omission and not unintentional? The only reason we can figure out is because they doesn't use the word shagaga. You see the minutia here of this? Because you're going, well, what's the difference between an unintentional and then touching something ceremonially unclean and not being aware of it and then being told later on? It's not shagaga. That's what I got, okay? So these have been grouped together to be called sins of omission. Now, the first one I think is obvious and clear. That's kind of when you know you should speak up. You see the little old lady trying to cross the road and you don't help her and she gets hit by a car. That was the dumbest thing that just came off the top of my head. But when you know there's something you should do, because we usually think of sin as what? Doing something I wasn't supposed to do, right? But no, this is when I'm actually supposed to do something and I don't do it. That's one sin of omission. The next two examples are something that I know I should do something, is when I become aware after the fact. Like, gosh, I did something, I didn't even know I did it. But somebody, maybe your spouse, just saying, points it out to you, hey, you sinned. Oh, wow, I did. Okay, right, And then the fourth one's kind of really interesting, a sort of self-imposed oath that I didn't ever do or forgot about, and someone's like, hey, man, didn't you promise you were going to do that thing? You're like, okay, sins of omission. Okay, purification sacrifices. These are things you do to become purified, whether they were because they were unintentional sins or sins of omission. Where do they occur in the New Testament? Well, it's all about what you have to do to enter into the holy place. Not the holy place, but the tent of meeting. So from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 12 through 14, speaking of Jesus, he did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place. So notice it's about entering into, once for all, by his own blood, and thus obtaining an eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. Now that's talking about the purification ceremony. You see the difference? That's not speaking of the burnt sacrifice of atonement. How much more then, I'm continuing in Hebrews, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse? Now that word is the same word that's translated purify. That's why we link this verse to the purification ceremony and not the burnt offering. Purify our consciences from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God. My point is this, that verse out of Hebrews that I just read to you, because of the terminology used in it, is clearly talking about Christ as a purification offering, not as the burnt offering. But don't you also get the sense of, well, what's the difference? They seem to both be talking about the forgiveness of sins, and I would agree. Okay, so just so you know, trying to figure out what the difference is, as far as we can tell, it has something to do with purification, okay? So that you might enter the tent of the meeting, and it's a different type than the burnt offering atonement. Everybody seems to be okay with that? All right, okay, good. Okay, good. But just so you know, you can't believe how long it took me to study to figure out what I just told you right there. Like it got kind of exhausting a little bit. But like I've told you, it's taken me double or triple the amount of time to put these things together. And then what happens is I get down to the end of these long bunny trails and realize nobody's really totally sure. And I go, okay, back, where were we? But then Jesus, yeah, amen. Now, the next one does actually seem to make a little bit more sense. Now, remember, we're continuing in a line of offerings: burnt offering, grain offering, peace and fellowship offering, purification offerings, right? We're at 4. We're now going to do the 5th type of offering, and it's called the reparation offering. Now, it starts in chapter 5, verse 14. Notice it says the guilt offering in the NIV, right? But that, just so you know, is not scripture, right? That just is what the NIV came up with. And I'm really bummed that they did that, because I think it's really confusing. Because then you're like, well, what's the difference between being guilty and having sin? And isn't being under sin the same thing as being guilty? And I don't think it provides enough of a, what's the word I'm looking for? A definition for what the next set of offering is. And so I want you to read this one. I think it'll become really clear quickly. Read chapter 5, verse 14 with me, because this sets up a break and a new offering. The Lord said to Moses, when a person commits a violation and sins unintentionally, in regard to any of the Lord's holy things, he is to bring to the Lord as a penalty a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value in silver, according to the sanctuary shekel. It is a guilt offering. Okay, now in the same context, now flip over to chapter 6. And this is still talking about the same kind of offering, verses 1 to 5. And this is where it's going to make more sense for you. The Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving his neighbor about something entrusted to him or left in his care or stolen, or if he cheats him, or if he finds lost property and lies about it, or if he swears falsely, or if he commits any such sin that people may do, when he thus sins and becomes guilty, he must return what he has stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to him, or the lost property. It sounds like the book of armaments, doesn't it? Yeah. Or the lost property he found, or whatever it was, God, he swore falsely about. He must make restitution in full, add a 5th of the value to it, and give it all to the owner or on the day he presents his guilt offering. You get now the word reparations. Yeah, this is called reparations, okay? Now, a lot of these rules about what you can and can't do about stealing an ox or borrowing whatever, some of them are in Exodus, some of them are in Leviticus, some of them are in Numbers. They're sort of spread out all across the law. So the difference seems to be between guilt offering and sin offering here is the restitution, the idea of restitution and compensation. So the occasions for a reparation offering: to sin against the holy things. Well, this is kind of unclear. What does it mean to sin against the holy things? So some of the things that have been suggested would be like eating holy food wrongly. You know, if that had been dedicated for a specific purpose and you did it wrong. If you defile a pure instrument, because the instruments, everything that was inside of the temple was considered holy and pure, whatever. If you failed in a vow, or if you presented a tithe or a sacrifice in a manner unworthy, then you would defile that holy thing. We have a specific example from the scriptures in Numbers chapter 6. It's an interesting story. A Nazirite who has taken a Nazirite vow It's a really interesting example. Happens to be in a room when somebody dies. And a Nazirite cannot be in the same room as a dead person. And because he was in the room when the guy died, it is considered a violation of the Nazirite vow. What was supposed to be a holy thing is now unholy. And in number 6, they have him do this guilt offering, or what is called the reparations offering. And he has to pay extra money to the temple and bring extra stuff. Does that make sense? That was one occasion that we know it was a reparations to it. He had to bring an additional offering, not just the normal sacrifice. Here's what's interesting regarding these sins. When you look into the types of sins that they're talking about, it seems to be that it is always better when you come to the temple to come owning up to your sin, right? Rather than be found out, okay? In Exodus, for example, there's times when your sin is uncovered. You have been declared guilty by a trial. In those cases, they might stone you to death. But for the same sin, if you show up at the temple like, I sinned, then you can go under one of these reparations offerings or a guilt offering, and you can be forgiven. In our own society, we have a way of doing the same thing. Have you ever heard that the cover-up was always worse than the crime? And had you just come clean, it would have gone much better for you. Or I've been reading a lot of Harry Bosch novels, or if you ever watched, I don't watch very much of it, but in the past, long time ago, what is that one TV show? It's the most longest running crime show ever. Law and Order? Law and Order. If you've ever watched Law and Order, half the show is about the DA saying, well, we'll make you a deal. Because, right? Because if you confess to the crime and you save the government through going through a big trial, you will get a certain punishment. But if you insist on going through a trial and you are declared guilty, you get a way, 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 way worse punishment. You see how that idea goes all the way back to Leviticus chapters 5 and 6? It is better to come as and bring sort of your sin ahead of you. Okay, let me keep going on this. The meaning behind all of this is really interesting when it comes to reparations. And that is this. It shows us that there is both a social and spiritual dimension to sin. I love this idea because I think I came to this idea late in my faith, and I'm kind of embarrassed by it. And so you've heard me say it a lot at church and in this Bible study because I don't want anybody else to miss it. To explain to you what I mean by that, I want to quote from Frederick Buechner from a book that Lewis gave me. Thank you, Lewis. And I loved it. It was about the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, and it made me think about it in a way I hadn't thought about it before. The story of Adam is the story of each of us. We were created to serve God and each other in love, but each of us chose instead to serve himself as God. And in doing so, to do the final math for you, we broke the binds between us and God and us and each other. You want to know why there's so much strife in the world right now today? It's all sin. All of it comes back to sin. Instead of being busy serving each other, we're serving ourselves. You can boil it all down to that. So the redemption story, and here's the thing, and here's why I make such a big deal about it. I think that the evangelical church has taught a lopsided view on this. I think the evangelical church makes such a big deal about us being restored to God that we tend to think that's what it's all about. God so loved me, he sent his son to die for me. I just don't like all those other people that he died, right? Right? But I'm not going to go to church. I was offended once at church. Or Oh, I tried going to church, but I got stabbed in the back. Or that guy, he calls himself a Christian. I'm not going to talk to him. You get my point on this? Yeah? By the way, I gave an exaggerated example for that, right? But really, it happens all the time in churches. We resent other Christians and da-da-da-da, but we think, but I'm special with God. And that's all that matters. That is not all that matters. It really, really matters to God that we be restored to each other, okay? It's as big a deal in both directions, right? Okay, so this is interesting. Even though it's not brought up specifically right now in these verses, it clearly is in Exodus and other places, as we're going to find out in Leviticus. I thought this was really interesting. The idea of personal property. Think about that. If you steal somebody's cow, you owe them a cow and a half, right? You are not supposed to take somebody else's cow. Now think about that. Well, what makes it your cow? Well, I raised it. So what does that make it your cow? And we all, isn't it funny how we all seem to understand? Which, by the way, is a really interesting thing. To me, it's a proof of a transcendent reality, because we all think, well, of course that's what? Fair? That should be the law. But what is fair? What is law? And who decides it? Isn't it interesting that every human seems to understand that at its most base level, and yet it's an immaterial idea. But everybody believes in it. Everybody acts upon it. Every 3-year-old can go, he got the bigger piece. It's not fair. What is fair? Fair is not a material object that you can prove by running scientific experiments on it. It is a transcendent idea, and yet every single human on the planet has it. Now, why I think it's a big idea is because it reminds me of a story I've probably shared with some of you before about the conversation I once had at the bell desk at the Marriott. Because one of the bellmen said, well, there has to be both good and evil in the universe. They balance each other out. And I was like, no, you're wrong. And you know me, I'm not very confrontational, but I was not going to sit and listen to such a lie be told. He's like, what do you mean? No, there has to be. I go, no. Good exists on its own, and it has no need of evil. Evil is a parasite on good. Here's what I mean by that. Look at things like intelligence, creativity, power, energy. All those things on their own are good, right? Evil can come and take those things and use them for evil, right? But it cannot possess its own intelligence, because intelligence, by definition, is good, right? So evil cannot have a good. It can only take a good thing and twist it, you know? And that's why it even says in Romans, they are inventors of doing evil. They are using God's good intelligence and twisting it for selfish purposes, right? Let me give you an example from history. A good village. They work hard. They work together. They live in a fallen, sinful world. So it takes work to gain food, right? Before the fall, you just went and picked fruit, right? After the fall, you have to till the soil. You have to water, plant, weed. I don't need to expand upon it. They create a bumper crop or a harvest to feed themselves, when lo and behold, from over the hill, here comes evil. Yeah, Genghis Khan or whatever, right? They didn't work hard. They didn't put in the effort. They come and they kill the villagers and they steal the food. Which one of those people is evil? It's clear. Isn't it obvious? Everybody knows. Even the people that are killing know they're doing evil, right? You see the difference? Now, let me ask you this. Do the villagers need Genghis Khan? No. But does Genghis Khan need the villagers? Straight. You see the difference there, right? Okay. What does this have to do with anything? This has to do with the idea of personal property. To steal is wrong and evil, and God understands that. That you, if you've stolen it, you need to either repay it, or, well, back in the Old Testament, we'll put you to death, right? Because you've done wrong. Or if you've stolen something and you get caught, you have an opportunity to be restored and to be forgiven. Does that make sense? Okay, that was a long blah, 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 blah for all of that. Let me finish up what the New Testament says about reparations offerings, and then I'll pause and let somebody else talk for a minute. Okay. Though we don't have a specific mentioned reparations offering in the New Testament, Certainly the idea is this, that when we sin against each other, we have sinned against God. This is why we say in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, forgive us our debts even as we have forgiven our debtors, right? It is to understand that we have sinned against other people and they have sinned against us, and there has been a break not only between us and God, but between us and other people, and we need to do what we can in our sphere, at least, to forgive and look at how important it is, right? Super important. Forgive us even as we forgive. It's given equal balance. But also we have Jesus saying this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 and 24. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. In other words, if you're harboring or your brother is harboring whatever, no, God says you need to make that right. So if you have stolen, you have sinned, you need to ask them for forgiveness. It's interesting to me because Jesus says that about the altar. But we don't have an altar anymore. Where is our altar? It's right here, yeah? This is the altar, your gift, yeah? And so lastly, this idea, and then I'll shut up for a minute. Christ is the ultimate and the perfect sacrifice for all these offerings. We've talked about 5 different offerings here. He's the burnt offering, he's the peace offering, he's the grain offering, and the purification offering. So, we don't have to compensate God with more. Does that make sense? The reason I say that is Jesus' sacrifice was compensation enough, okay? So when we talk about making reparations, right, we don't owe God more than we offended. Because we can't possibly give God more, because what we offer to God, according to Romans chapter 12, is our lives, right? We can't give more than we possess. And God doesn't need more than we possess because what we owe him has been completely fulfilled in the sacrifice of his Son, Jesus Christ. We don't owe Christ plus. Does that make sense? Yeah? We are forgiven 100% completely by grace and grace alone. Which, thank God, because if all we had were our pitiful lives, right? Here's what I want to say. Have you ever heard sort of the idea of the guy that sinned and then spent the rest of his life trying to make it up? You know, we see this sort of theme in modern movies and stuff. Do you realize you can't do that? That doesn't work in Christian theology. You can't sin as a youngster in some horrible way and then feel like I spend the rest of my life trying to pay off this debt. There is no debt. The debt is gone, 100% gone. What you have instead is you bring your offering to the temple. Only you are the offering. You bring yourself, and in love, you lay your life down and you say, I'm yours, God. What do you have for me? And if you're a young believer, like I remember me when I first heard those, you'd think, what a horrible, awful thing. I got to do whatever God says. Yeah? Did anybody else think that too? Oh, crap, now I got to do what God says. I don't know if you know that. That was the first words out of my mouth as a born-again believer. I said, oh, excrement, only I didn't use the word excrement. That was the Greek for the word I used. And the reason I said that was because I thought my life's over. Now I got to do... What I didn't realize, that was the truth. My life was over. It was my old sinful life, if you'd been in church on Sunday, that had been drowned, right? That died to self. What God had for me was a real life. Real life. And that is why we offer ourselves at the altar, right? We offer ourselves as living sacrifices according to Romans 12. And that is sort of the summary of the 5 main offerings. That was a huge mouthful. You must have questions. It's really, really unclear. Is it? Yeah. And the one thing we know is the Day of Atonement, right? And then it seems as if, like, the burnt offering was daily. In fact, I read something about like in fact, remind me, I'll go look it up, that there was like 12 specific offerings they did every day. They would do it.
Who did it? For the burnt offering, would I have to bring my sacrifice?
Okay, it seems more likely that if you sinned, right, you would do the first of the purification offerings.
I'd go broke.
I know. Yeah, isn't that true? Yeah. And that, by the way, is something we're going to get to if we got about 15 minutes left about that idea. Yeah, about that idea. But when I looked into it, it's sort of unclear. Does anybody else look that up and have a better answer than what I just gave? And how often did you? It's weird because you think about it like Jesus himself as a boy. It seems to me they go up to the temple, right? Once a year, right? And offer sacrifice. Yeah. Now, what happens if you live? I'll get you a page. What happens if you live up at where the tribe of Dan? That's a long way to go, man. Which is why Joaz, which one was the evil king that broke away? He created his own altar. Yeah. And then remember, they kicked out the Samaritans. They would not let the Samaritans near the temple, and so the Samaritans started doing their own offerings, which is why the woman at the well says, you guys worship on your mountain and we worship on ours. Yeah. Sorry, Paige. Okay, that's true. Yeah, which we will get to at the end of the book. Yeah. Okay, that's true. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Briar. Yeah, and I'm not going to speak for Paul on that one because there's a lot of debate about exactly what he meant. But I certainly know that I'm guilty of this as well. And I say the word guilty very intentionally because as my good Presbyterian friend John Bombaro, where's Greg? Greg, appreciate it. I was looking for Carrie more. Yeah, but John Bombaro said to me one time, he said, if God has forgiven your sin, who the hell do you think you are to not forgive your sin?
Exactly.
Isn't that radical? Like he very intently said that almost as a threat. And yet, I'm still, on days, I drag my chain of my sin around behind me, denying Christ's sacrifice for that sin, which is a horrific thing. And I believe it's part of the sinful nature from Romans chapter 7. Or it starts in chapter 6 in Romans 7. Wicked man that I am, who will separate me from this body of death? Because though we have been crucified in the flesh has been rendered powerless. It has not been removed yet. And so we still struggle with the sinful nature. Anyways, we get too far on that. I'll go Lewis first and then Lori, yeah. Yes, and that was what I was going to say. I'm glad you came to that. Because we are never good enough to take communion, ever. Yeah, because if we assume we're good enough to take communion, then we're assuming we don't need communion, and bingo, there you are. That's actually a great process that you work through. I enjoy that. Lori? Isn't there a age of accountability in the Old Testament? Do they have a right of manhood kind of thing? Or
13.
13? Is that what it is? So that's probably it. Okay, the next section here, which is why I want to get to, otherwise we'll never know why I said, what does Leviticus have to do with the Olympic flame and Van Halen, is in this next part right here. It's really instructions for the priests. It starts in chapter 6, verse 8, and it goes through the end of chapter 7. And the main thrust of all this is sort of, when I say the main thrust, there's a zillion details in here, but it's sort of the proper eating and distribution of sacrificed meat. Who can eat what and where they can eat it. In most cases, only the priests could eat, except for the fellowship offering, which is why I jokingly say that was everybody else's favorite offering. And we're going to clarify some of that now. In these next two chapters, there's a lot of duplication between what we just read in chapters 1 to 5. They're the same sacrifices: burnt offering, grain offering, peace offering, purification, and reparations. But now they're presented in a different order. Why? We don't know. Here's a quote from one of the commentators. The modern reader of Leviticus inevitably asks, why there should be this repetition and apparent incoherence in the arrangement of the material in the book. My point exactly, right? But the main difference that we can tell here is at the beginnings of chapters 1 and 4, and I went back to look this up, the beginning parts of chapters 1 and 4, God says, tell the Israelites, right? So tell who? Everybody. But right now we have, look at chapter 6, verse 8. The Lord said to Moses, give Aaron and his sons this command. Or verse 25, say to Aaron and his sons. So these seems to be more specifically for the priests. A layman would want to know when, which is what our big question is right now, when to offer the burnt or purification offering and what kind of animal to bring. That was covered in chapter 1 to 5. But a priest would have much more interest in the ritual itself. What parts are burned, and obviously what part could he eat. And even then, there's not a hard definition between what happens in 1 through 5 and 6 and 7. It seems to repeat a lot of the same thing. But I did want to at least read these parts right here. From chapter 6, read verse 9. Where is it? Give Aaron his sons this command. These are the regulations for the burnt offering. The burnt offering is to remain on the altar hearth throughout the night till morning, and the fire must be kept burning on the altar. Night shift. Night shift, right. Then go to verse 12. The fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning the priest is to add firewood and arrange the burnt offering on the fire and burn the fat of the fellowship offerings on it. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously. It must not go out. Now, why is that? Well, for one, they to answer, whose question was it about? Your question. They must have been busy. They must have been doing burning all day long. And I was looking for a specific verse. I couldn't find it today. Something about the continual smoke going up from the temple without end it was going. But I found something really cool. It was not an original idea. And I'm going to read you 2 verses to give you the gist of it right here. And when I heard this, I was like, oh, that is cool. You ready for this? In Leviticus chapter 9, which we'll get there next week, actually, talking about what was happening at the tabernacle. Chapter 9, verse 24. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offerings and the fat portions on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell down. Then years and years later, after they've gone into the promised land and conquered the promised land, and then David, and then after David, Solomon finally builds a temple. From 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 1, when Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. John Calvin reckons that the first burnt offerings in the tabernacle and the temple were all lit from fire from heaven, and they kept that flame going. That flame never went out, and that is why I sent you a picture of the Olympic torch. Did you know how they get the flame for the Olympic torch? Here's some trivia for you.
That's scary.
Well, yes, but you're rare for this. I actually went, this is what you pay me the big dollars for. I went to YouTube today and actually watched, since 1936, this is what they've been doing. Before the Olympic torch gets lit, they have a big sort of pagan celebration in Olympia, Greece, using a parabolic mirror. You know what a parabolic mirror is? I knew you guys would. It is this really unique cone-shaped mirror that you can use to light things on fire. And they quite literally have a Vestal Virgin, 11 of them, but one in particular has the torch, and it has a little piece of flammable cloth on it, and they have a parabolic mirror that's facing the sun, and she sticks it in this mirror, and I saw, you can make one from the bottom of a Coke can. I really went down the bunny trail here. Yeah, I got a DIY parabolic thing. Yeah, it's fascinating. There's this one dude, a survivalist, but anyways. And what happens is she lights that flame for that year's Olympiad, And then immediately the first thing they do is make copies, backup, like a hard drive, yeah? And they make 2 or 3 backup flames, and then they put them in what's called a minor lamp, which is a safe lamp so that they can put it on an airplane. And they put 3 or 4 of these Olympic flames on the airplane, and then they fly it to Brazil or Seoul or Korea, wherever it goes, right? And are you ready for this? Then they have a special torch. And the torch itself has the regular flame on top, but even within that little thing, they've built a backup flame. And they make a really big deal about it, that it has to be from one of those original sources that goes all the way back to the celebration in Olympia. And then at the end of the ceremony, they put it out. Did you know that? I didn't know any of that. But I thought, hey, that was kind of cool. That's sort of part of this eternal flame thing that we have going on at the temple, that it came from the first, the flame of God, and then they kept that flame going.
Should have sang the Bangle song, Eternal Flame.
An eternal flame. I know. I thought of that. I was going to have you play it tonight, Doc. We're almost out of time. You guys have 4 minutes, 5 minutes? I got one last thing, and we'll get to Van Halen, yes. Well, from what I understand, they were like a nomadic tribe who would keep their herds with them. Yeah, yeah.
Why did they get hungry then?
I'm going to guess not. I mean, you know what I've read on a number of different occasions in the different guys that I'm reading, is that sacrificing these animals was at a great cost. Because, you know what, I don't think we would think much of it. Oh, what, I got to bring a lamb once a year? All right, what's a lamb cost? $100? Really? Anybody in here know? What's a lamb cost? No? Where's Stacy Boucher when you need her, yeah? But it's not that much, probably. But my guess is, no, not my guess. This is what I'm reading from guys that would know, that meat was scarce. In fact, are you ready for this? One guy, was it Wyndham, I think, speculated that going up to the temple to do the fellowship offering might have been the only time they ate meat that year. Okay. See, we kind of blow our minds on that. But you know, this kind of thinking, I had dinner with a guy from Compassion. Oh, we're never going to have time to finish. I'll have to save it for next week. But, but no, I'm going to answer your question. A guy that when I went with Compassion, born and raised in, not Kenya, not Nairobi, what, Idi Amin? Uganda, thank you. Born and raised as a street urchin in Uganda, told us the story that when he was a little boy, he didn't eat meat till he was like 9 or 10 years old. Because when his family killed a chicken every once in a blue moon, right? He lived on cornstarch mostly, yeah? Only the adults ate the meat. And the kids would get to drink the meat broth. That was all. He never ate meat. They could not afford meat. And this, by the way, is in the 20th century, right? Again, our Western mind just goes, wait, what? Right? Yeah. Now, by the way, as you're aware, the Israelites asked for meat and they got a whole bunch of quail. Right. Till it was coming out of their noses, apparently, right? That's what God said. Tom? Oh, that's really interesting. I'm just laughing because it gives us a clue as to why the Pharisees were such experts in what? The law. Man, they had a law for, they had a rule for everything, yeah? Let me just wrap up with this idea, because we're at 1 minute overtime right now. Let me just wrap up with this. Remember this about when I say about the eternal flame was kind of a reminder to sort of Lori's point and Paige's point as well, that the constant need for atonement, it never ended. The flame could never go out. It was sacrificing all the time because they could never, as Mark said, like, I could never atone enough. And Israel was aware of it. How different is the sacrifice of Christ? By the way, I went and looked it up because I've taught this on a number of occasions until the point where I don't remember where I heard it, so I started to doubt myself. So I went and looked it up today, and I think I'm correct on this. There is no evidence whatsoever with all the descriptions of how to build a temple or a tabernacle that there were any seats anywhere within the tent of the meeting. And everywhere when it talks about the priests, they are always what? Standing. It always says the priest standing before the altar. They couldn't sit down, with this idea that the constant sacrificing Christ comes. He is the ultimate sacrifice. He's the high priest. He's buried, resurrected. He goes to heaven. What does he do? Sits down. He sat down. Why? Because one sacrifice and it's done. He never has to be sacrificed again. In fact, some people would say, mosquito, sorry. I just sacrificed. Oh, it had blood too, apparently, yeah. Apparently, bless you. Bless you, right? The idea that we don't forgive ourselves is to imply that Christ needs to be sacrificed again. He does not. And that's why we do not need to forgive ourselves again. And by the way, I will just tell you the Van Halen thing, one last thing. Can you guys handle the Van Halen story? Sorry, 1 minute. Van Halen was famous when I was a kid for one of the things they had when you set up their backstage area. The promoter, the concert promoter who puts everything together, the stage, the lights, and what food they wanted, it comes in a thing called a writer. You would get a writer, and they would tell you specifically what they would want. And Van Halen had in their writer, they wanted a large bowl of M&Ms with all the brown M&Ms removed. Now, when I heard that as a kid, and for years, that story was always told as they were just entitled rich rock stars. And the story was one time they showed up backstage and there was a bowl of M&Ms. It had the brown ones in it, and they trashed the backstage area. Ha ha, wouldn't it be nice to be a spoiled rock star? Later on, it came to find out there was a reason. Anybody know the story already? You know what the reason was? The reason was this. Those writers are very detailed, specific instructions of what they want for their sound. They want specific amplifiers with specific wattage. They want specific lights. They want specific stage. It has to be exactly that deep and that wide so that their road crew can show up the day before the concert, have the equipment that they need so that they can put it together. And the reason they put the M&M thing in there is they wanted to make sure that the people that were supposed to set up had read the whole thing. Because if they blew off that part, the M&M thing, who knew what else they blew off? And it was their litmus test. So God has these extremely specific things he wants them to pay attention to. Some of them we might scratch our head and go, what was the big deal about that? I want to add it into at the end, and I had a Calvin quote that I've lost somewhere now along the way. Maybe I have it here, yeah. Calvin, we should pay really specific attention to the new covenant worship details, right? With exactly the same attention to detail, with similar reverence and respect as an Old Testament priest. Does that make sense? Yeah? In other words, God's not, it's not like, we don't got to worry about any of it. I'll live the way I want to live. No. We should pay attention to how Jesus Christ tells us how we live under the new covenant with the exact kind of reverence and attention to detail as the Old Testament priest did in Leviticus. So take the brown M&Ms out. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for tonight's study, God, and I just pray for all of us, Lord, to pay attention to you. And thank you for grace and that sacrifice being done. And I pray for anybody in this room right now that struggles with forgiving themselves as one who struggles with it as well. Father, may we hand our sins over to you and receive fully your forgiveness that has been bought with the blood of your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen? Amen. Hey, thanks for joining us for this week's episode, and you can always find out more great stuff at PastorDain.com.